What do you think? It don't make sense, does it? No. Why, no. It's upsetting. Okay. Go ahead. Run and play. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me again as I continue to read and examine William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith from an Atheist Perspective. Today we're going to do Chapter 2, which is titled The Absurdity of Life Without God. And the question that Craig considers in this chapter is, what is the significance of life if you don't believe in God? Or what is the significance of life and of the universe, of existence in general, in a post-theistic setting, when we have abandoned our belief in God? And this is a subject that Craig recommends to apologists in training, that they examine with their mark the unsaved person to whom they're proselytizing, witnessing, before bringing up the question of the existence of God. So, Craig, in this chapter, as in the previous chapter, as in most of the chapters of the book, begins with a section on the historical background of the subject. And this time I'm going to briefly summarize what he says, because it does tie in very closely with his own thoughts on the matter. He summarizes the thoughts of several philosophers and writers from the past on the subject of life without God. And the first one that he talks about is Blaise Pascal. Craig describes Pascal's argument, his apologetic, that a Christian worldview is preferable to an atheistic worldview because without God, man faces life. It's just a brief interval. It's a meaningless life, bookended by nothingness. And man without God, for this reason, is miserable. But also, man is great because despite his predicament, man has the capability of perceiving that predicament. He has the ability to think and to perceive and to search for an answer to his misery, that is, God. Craig also touches on Pascal's wager, which I'm sure we all are way too familiar with, which states that when the odds for the existence of God and the non-existence of God are even, it is sensible to wager that God does exist rather than that God doesn't exist. Note the part of Pascal's wager that says that the odds have to be even, because that part is rarely discussed when Pascal's wager is mentioned by Christians as a proselytizing tool. When you as an atheist or a non-Christian are confronted with Pascal's wager, they rarely mention the bit about, well, if the odds for the existence and non-existence are even. Because I would argue that they most definitely are not even, especially if the God in question is the specific God of the Bible. I also noticed, reading Craig's summary of Pascal, that Pascal's tendency toward wish thinking and appeals to consequences has definitely rubbed off on Craig, as we will see as we move ahead in this chapter. Craig loves wish thinking and he loves appeals to consequences, especially when he talks about things like meaning and purpose, which he does repeatedly in this chapter. So then after Pascal, he moves on to Dostoevsky. And Craig begins his praise of Dostoevsky by taking a shot at C.S. Lewis. He disparages Lewis by wishing that modern evangelicals would turn away from Lewis, with whom he feels they are unduly fascinated, and turn instead to embrace Dostoevsky, who Craig considers a far, far grander writer. See how smart William Lane Craig is? He reads Dostoevsky, and he thinks Dostoevsky is better than C.S. Lewis. Craig also mentions how Dostoevsky was fascinated and tormented by the problem of evil, and he references the Grand Inquisitor from the Brothers Karamazov, but he disputes the perception of some that Dostoevsky himself was an atheist, or that the Grand Inquisitor was sort of the author's voice. Dostoevsky's real intention, says Craig, was to defend theism by suggesting that suffering builds character and pulls those that suffer closer to God, and also, quote, negatively, he tried to show that if the existence of God is denied, then one is landed in a complete moral relativism, so that no act, regardless of how dreadful or heinous, can be condemned by the atheist. Hence, atheism is destructive of life and ends logically in suicide. Perhaps one reason why modern Christians prefer Lewis to Dostoevsky is because they know Lewis is on their side, whereas Dostoevsky's own religious beliefs are much more complicated, and not nearly as easy to define as Craig suggests here by just asserting that no, what he really wanted to do was defend theism. It's not quite that cut and dry. And I'm not exactly a Dostoevsky scholar, so don't by no means take my word for it, but it's always been my understanding that while Dostoevsky didn't really seem to be an atheist at all, he certainly wasn't a traditional church-going, priest-respecting Christian either. Craig doesn't seem to be any better at literary analysis than he is at philosophy. Poor guy. I wonder if he'll find something that he's good at someday. Next, we move on to Kierkegaard, and Craig describes Kierkegaard's 3 stages of life. There's the aesthetic stage, which is self-centered. There's the ethical stage, which is guided by a desire to adhere to moral principles. And then there is the religious stage, which is the stage you reach when the ethical stage gets too hard and you just want to turn your brain off and pretend that all the tough questions have already been answered by the old man in the sky in his magic book. Okay, so I embellished that last stage a little bit. And then after Kierkegaard, we move on to Francis Schaeffer. And Schaeffer faults the denial of absolute truths in the views of philosophers such as Hegel as the ultimate cause of a line of despair, as he terms it, that has marred modern culture. Without these absolute truths, Schaeffer says, man's existence is an absurdity. And Craig says, quote, only by affirming belief in the absolute God of Christianity can man and his culture avoid inevitable degeneracy, meaninglessness, and despair. Craig also says, quote, Schaeffer warns that unless Western man returns to the Christian world and life view, nothing will stop the trend from degenerating into population control and human breeding. Only a theistic worldview can save the human race from itself. And to that I ask, so which is it then? Is it a theistic worldview that can save humanity from itself, or must it be the specific theism imagined by Christianity? Because Craig, as we shall see, and many other Christian apologists love to conflate the existence of God with the existence of their God. They take theism to mean Christianity. And coming up with a compelling argument for the existence of any God is hard enough. Coming up with a compelling argument for the existence of the specific God described in the Bible is orders of magnitude more difficult, what with how full of shit we know the Bible is. Having completed the historical background, Craig moves into the assessment section of the chapter, and he begins with a discussion of the necessity of God and immortality. Without God, Craig reiterates, life is ultimately pointless, and he says, quote, if God does not exist, then both man and the universe are inevitably doomed to death. Compared to the infinite stretch of time, the span of man's life is but an infinitesimal moment, and yet this is all the life he will ever know. And Craig talks about what Pat Tillich terms the threat of non-being, that is, the knowledge that though we exist now, someday we will cease to exist. And Craig says, quote, I remember vividly the first time my father told me that someday I would die. Somehow as a child the thought had just never occurred to me. When he told me, I was filled with fear and unbearable sadness, and though he tried repeatedly to reassure me that this was a long way off, that did not seem to matter. Whether sooner or later, the undeniable fact was that I would die and be no more, and the thought overwhelmed me. You know, until I read that quote that I just shared with you, I never honestly thought that I would say this, but I know where Craig's coming from here. I identify with him very closely when I read that quote. This is almost exactly how I learned about death when I was a child. It wasn't from my dad, it was from my mom, but still everything else is very close. Even being told by my parent that death was a long time off as an attempt at consolation, and it didn't really work. I know exactly what Craig is talking about here. I've totally been there, and I know exactly how he felt, and I imagine in his most honest moments how he probably still feels. Craig then extends the inevitability of death to the universe as well. It's not just us that will die as individuals, it's also everything else. And he cites the ever-accelerating expansion and the eventual heat death of the universe, And he says, quote, "The universe is plunging toward inevitable extinction. Death is written throughout its structure. There is no escape. There is no hope." And though I usually don't like to state it so direly, there really isn't a whole lot to argue factually with what Craig is saying here. He's stating what I believe and what is the scientific consensus. That life is finite, that we will all die and cease to exist someday, and eventually also not only us, but our civilization, our species, our planet, and ultimately the universe entire will cease to exist, at least as we see it today. And that can be an incredibly depressing thought. These are facts, so far as we can know them, that can be just very troubling and very dark and very bleak. They're big, dark ideas, and they can be difficult to accept and to reconcile. But why do I get the feeling that acceptance and reconciliation to these cold, hard facts of reality is not where Craig is going with this? Next section, the absurdity of life without God and immortality. Without God and without eternal life, our lives have no ultimate significance, value, or purpose, Craig says. And Craig is really starting to repeat himself here, and he'll repeat himself pretty much for the rest of the chapter. I'll do my best to try and summarize it without sounding as repetitive as Craig actually sounds in the book. No ultimate meaning without immortality in God is the next section. Craig asks whether or not it really even matters if an individual simply passes out of existence after he dies. A life might have relative significance in the way it affects the life of another or influences history, but this is only relative significance, not ultimate significance. Ultimately, Craig concludes, life makes no difference. And ditto for the universe for the same reasons. If the universe is destined to cease to exist no matter what difference does it make if the universe ever existed or not? And Craig says, quote, "And because our lives are ultimately meaningless, the activities we fill our lives with are also meaningless. This is the horror of modern man. Because he ends in nothing, he is nothing." But, Craig stresses, more is needed to render life ultimately meaningful than mere immortality. Without God, he says, life and the universe would still be ultimately meaningless even if they lasted forever. And Craig cites a handful of 20th century writers who expressed a sense of futility of life without God in their work. He cites Samuel Beckett, who wrote the play Waiting for Godot, about two men who spend the entire play waiting for a third character who never actually arrives, and then went on to theorize that one could time travel within his own lifetime, leaping back and forth from life to life, hoping that each leap would be the leap home. Then he also cites Hermann Hesse, who wrote the novel Steppenwolf, with its protagonist Harry Haller, who smashes his own reflection in the mirror at one point after realizing that his life has been meaningless. And then he brings up the existentialists, specifically Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, or Albert Camus as we call him around these parts, who wrote about life being essentially meaningless. And Craig says, quote, "Thus, if there is no God, then life itself becomes meaningless. Man and the universe are without ultimate significance." Well, as I said a moment ago, Craig really repeats himself throughout this chapter. He goes on to make essentially these same arguments two more times, one right after the other in this chapter, only instead of discussing significance or meaning, his subjects are first value and then purpose. So I'll try to cover those two very quickly. Next we have no ultimate value without immortality and God. Without God, there are no objective standards of right and wrong, says Craig. No objective morality. And he says, quote, "In a world without God, who is to say which values are right and which are wrong? Who is to judge that the values of Adolf Hitler are inferior to those of a saint? The concept of morality loses all meaning in a universe without God." And he also says, quote, "This means that it is impossible to condemn war, oppression, or crime as evil. Nor can one praise brotherhood, equality, and love as good. For in a universe without God, good and evil do not exist. There is only the bare, valueless fact of existence, and there is no one to say, you are right and I am wrong. Moving on to no ultimate purpose without immortality and God. Without God and immortality, what's the goal of life? Craig says, quote, if God does not exist, then you are just a miscarriage of nature, thrust into a purposeless universe to live a purposeless life. So if God does not exist, that means that man and the universe exist to no purpose, since the end of everything is death, and that they came to be for no purpose, since they are only blind products of chance. In short, life is utterly without reason. Now there are three big problems that I see with what Craig is saying in this part of the chapter. First, whether he is talking about ultimate meaning, ultimate value, or ultimate purpose, this definition of ultimate is describing something that is imaginary. He goes on for 10 pages in this chapter about how without God, without immortality, there's no ultimate purpose to life, there's no ultimate morality, there's no ultimate value or meaning. And the thing is, I agree with him. I share that view. You're right. I mean, I don't necessarily tie it directly into God, as I'll get to in a minute, but I agree that there is no ultimate purpose. There's no ultimate meaning. But he and I part company on this issue because I don't see this as any kind of a crisis. This is nothing that we need to panic about. I'm not troubled by the lack of ultimate meaning or ultimate value or ultimate purpose, because even though I used to be a theist, even though I used to believe that such things were real, I now see these things as fantasies, as things that never ever existed. So I don't feel like I'm owed those things, and I don't miss those things any more than I miss being able to fly or see through walls. They were just never an option. So that's the first problem. Craig's ultimate values are imaginary. The second problem is Craig doesn't even attempt to demonstrate how the existence of God would make any difference as far as any of this is concerned. He asserts that it would make a difference repeatedly, but he never explains the how and the why. He says, without God, life is meaningless. Without God, life is without reason. Okay, so let's add God. What happens now? Why is life meaningful now? Because God says so? What is the purpose of life? Is it whatever God says it is? Why should I prefer having God dictate what my life means to me, to being able to discover and decide the meaning of my life for myself? Why is it better for God to impose meaning on me? And even if I concede that somehow through some magical means God is even capable of imbuing life with value and with meaning that it would not have without him, how is that ultimate value or ultimate meaning? Craig mentions morality here. He says without God there's no objective morality, but if morality is determined by God, that's not objective morality. And it doesn't have to be dictated by God either. A lot of times theists will try to argue with atheists on morality by saying, well, we're not saying that, murder is wrong because God says it's wrong. Murder is wrong because it's contrary to God's nature. But see, you're still setting God up as the standard. You're still determining your morality according to God. And that's subjective. Ultimate morality would be morality that stood over everything, God included. Ultimate purpose would be purpose that is there no matter what, that is subject to nothing. Ultimate value, ultimate meaning, the same thing. If you tie it to God, if you put it dependent on God, then it ceases to be ultimate. It becomes secondary, it becomes subjective by definition. And third, Craig, either intentionally because he's dishonest or accidentally because he's ignorant, is grossly misstating the scientific, naturalistic understanding of life and the universe and reality. He says that the universe is doomed to death, which seems to be the case given our current understanding, but he also says that there is no hope, which seems to me to be a very childish way of looking at it. If life is short and finite, if the universe is destined for heat death after a great expansion, if eventually the stars will all be so far apart that they'll be out of sight of each other and then they'll just burn out and die, and that's the ultimate fate of the universe. If immortality is a man-made fantasy, then that's not hopeless. That's just the nature of reality. That's just what we start with. And we should define our concepts of hope and meaning and value, etc., within that context, not within some imaginary fantasy scenario where God and everlasting life are part of the deal. If you say that anything short of eternal paradise is hopeless, then yes, things might seem pretty bleak when you consider the facts. But why would you make eternal paradise the standard? It doesn't exist. You can be hopeful that you and your friends and your family will have happy, healthy, safe, fulfilling lives. If you have children, you can be hopeful for your children. Think about the big things that give you hope for the future, the things that are beyond your own personal circle, whatever those things may be for you. For me, it's things like science and space exploration and wondering what the Large Hadron Collider will allow us to discover about the universe next. And does the fact that eventually the Large Hadron Collider will cease to exist, along with every other trace that we were ever here, rob me of that hope? No, because that's just part of the deal. That's the world that we were born into. Also, we are not a miscarriage of nature, as Craig so stupidly puts it. We are a product of nature. We are a part of nature. And we're a splendid product, if I do say so myself. We are able to perceive and think and feel and make decisions. Craig actually asks, I read a quote of him saying, "Without God, who decides what is right and wrong?" We do. Without God, who is to judge the actions of Adolf Hitler? We are. Us. We decide. We judge. Craig says that morality loses all meaning without God. He says without God, no one can condemn war or praise brotherhood. And what a deranged thing to say. The thing, and if you ask me, the only thing that gives our morality meaning and weight and consequence is the fact that we have decided for ourselves that these things are wrong and that these things are right, that these things are good and that these things are bad. If the opposite were true, if we had received our morality from on high, if we had just taken it off the shelf without thinking about it, then it would be absolutely meaningless. How can we condemn Hitler? How can we judge right and wrong? Because we are thinking, feeling beings. We are social animals capable of empathy, and we can ask moral questions and attempt to answer them. That's how. From here, Craig moves into a section called the practical impossibility of atheism. And in this section, he examines the three areas that he's already discussed, only he examines them from what he perceives to be the atheist perspective, to illustrate how impossible it is to live consistently and happily without a belief in God. So first, the meaning of life. Craig says, quote, "The point is this: if God does not exist, then life is objectively meaningless. But man cannot live consistently and happily knowing that life is meaningless. So in order to be happy, he pretends life has meaning. But this is, of course, entirely inconsistent, for without God, man and the universe are without any real significance." Again, an atheist doesn't have to pretend that life has meaning. As an atheist, I accept that God doesn't exist, that these concepts of ultimate meaning, etc., that Craig cherishes are imaginary. So I define the meaning of my life within the context of what I perceive to be reality, not within Craig's theistic fantasy land. Value of life. Craig says, quote, "First of all, atheistic humanists are totally inconsistent in affirming the traditional values of love and brotherhood. The point is that if there is no God, then objective right and wrong cannot exist." I just went over this. If right and wrong are defined relative to God, then they aren't objective, they're subjective. And there are plenty of reasons to affirm love and brotherhood apart from the belief that God is telling us to. society, empathy, our innate sense of conscience, the moral consensus of humanity. Craig blames the lack of absolute value for the horrors of the Holocaust, and he positively recommends to his students reading this book, these apologists in training, to bring up the Holocaust to atheists and to non-Christians, to force them to answer for the Holocaust. And he details a few of the crimes of Dr. Joseph Mengele, including an episode, this really lurid episode, where Mengele was angry at one of his nurses when he found out that the nurse had given the patient a lethal dose of morphine so that she could painlessly kill her baby, who had been the subject of Mengele's experiments. And Mengele was very outraged at his nurse, and he went into the common grave where the baby had been buried and dug it out to weigh it one last time to conclude his experiment. This really horrible story. Huge appeal to emotion, the only reason it's there. And not only is it an appeal to emotion, just the fact that he even tells the story and recommends that his students tell the story, but he employs italics to emphasize how horrible these things are, in case we miss the point. And I read it and thought, I figured, I guess the italics are for my benefit as an atheist, since I have no other way of knowing whether experimentation on and vivisection of human beings is wrong. And Craig says, quote, "A second problem is that if God does not exist and there is no immortality, then all the evil acts of men go unpunished and all the sacrifices of good men go unrewarded. But who can live with such a view?" Well, I can, for one, because I'm a grown-up and I accept the world as it is. I can live with the good people and the bad people all going to the same oblivion after death, because I have no reason to think that the world works any other way. And I define my morals and my sense of justice, etc., within that context, within that reality. And I feel like I've made this point like 30 times already in this video. Craig moves on to purpose of life, and he says, quote, "Finally, let's look at the problem of purpose in life. The only way most people who deny purpose in life live happily is either by making up some purpose, which amounts to self-delusion, or by not carrying their view to its logical conclusions." So what he's saying is that I don't think the purpose of my life is defined by the magic man in the sky that Craig believes in. And the purposes I do have for my life, the things that are important to me, are just delusions. As we saw in the last chapter, Craig puts his own worldview up on a pedestal above everyone who holds a different view. If you don't think the way he thinks, if you don't get your purpose from the same place that he does, then you are living in self-delusion. Now, there is a perfect two-word retort for this, and it's, let me see if I can remember it. Fuck you. Craig brings up the idea next of the noble lie, the notion that even though we all know that life has no ultimate meaning and purpose, etc., we should pretend that life has meaning in order to live happily and to inspire ourselves beyond self-interest. But, Craig says, quote, "Even the noble lie option is in the end unworkable. In order to be happy, one must believe in objective meaning, value, and purpose. But how can one believe in those noble lies while at the same time believing in atheism and relativism?" Hey, check it out, An Argument from Incredulity. It's nice to see him changing it up in the midst of all these appeals to consequences. Bill, can I call you Bill? Because I'm sure as fuck not going to call you Dr. Craig. I don't need you to tell me what I need to believe in order to be happy. I don't need you to tell me that I have to believe in objective meaning and objective value as you understand it to be happy. You don't have the power or the right to decide what I need to believe to be happy. You can't imagine how someone can be an atheist and not believe in the things you believe in and still be happy and still find reasons not to be self-centered, to be empathetic, to be helpful, to be compassionate and merciful and hopeful. But it's possible. And the fact that you can't imagine how that is possible is absolutely irrelevant. I could not give less of a fuck. The success of biblical Christianity. Craig says, quote, According to the Christian worldview, God does exist, and man's life does not end at the grave. In the resurrection body, man may enjoy eternal life and fellowship with God. Biblical Christianity, therefore, provides the two conditions necessary for a meaningful, valuable, and purposeful life for man: God and immortality. Thus, biblical Christianity succeeds precisely where atheism breaks down. Why? See, all Craig does here is make assertions, and not only assertions of facts like the existence of God and objective values and things like that, but also assertions of how things work. But it's not a given that God and immortality are necessary for life to have purpose and value and meaning. It's not a given that you have to believe in ultimate meaning in order to be happy in life. And it's not a given that biblical Christianity provides these things any better than anything else. You have to demonstrate that. You have to explain why that is. As Christopher Hitchens liked to say, that which is asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Saying thus when you haven't even attempted to make an argument isn't good enough. Conclusion. How sweet that is. Quote, "Now I want to make it clear that I have not yet shown biblical Christianity to be true, but what I have done is clearly spell out the alternatives. If God does not exist, then life is futile. If the God of the Bible does exist, then life is meaningful." Well, he hasn't spelled out anything. He's made assertions and hasn't even tried to demonstrate why we ought to accept them. He also says, quote, "Therefore, it seems to me that even if the evidence for these two options were absolutely equal, a rational person ought to choose biblical Christianity. It seems to me positively irrational to prefer death, futility, and destruction to life, meaningfulness, and happiness." But of course, the evidence for those two options is not even close to being equal. The existence of the biblical God is nowhere near as likely as the non-existence of that God. And that's why atheists prefer death and futility and destruction, although I don't choose to characterize the universe in such cynical terms, since I figure I'm fortunate to be here at all. But we think those things are true. We prefer them in the sense that we think those things are true. We think that's how the world is, whether we like it or not. And the meaningfulness and happiness that Craig is talking about, that Craig is offering as this wonderful alternative, are undemonstrated and imaginary. And why would anyone choose undemonstrated, imaginary happiness to finding real happiness in the world as it actually is? That sounds irrational to me. Practical application. Craig tells his students that many non-Christians will be driven to accept Christ after having the alternatives explained, as Craig has done in this chapter. You won't need to do anything else, he says. Just tell them how much life sucks without God, and some of them will come begging to be saved and be washed in the blood of Jesus just from that. However, though an unbeliever must sometimes be pushed, it must be done lovingly, Craig says, in a way that does not place him on the defensive. I find it interesting that Craig advises his students to do this when he apparently is completely incapable of doing it himself. And he says, quote, "Although students may give lip service to relativism, my experience is that 95% can be very quickly convinced that objective moral values do exist after all." Of course, the number of people you can persuade to your belief has no relevance whatsoever to whether or not your belief is true, but Craig would rather keep score than pursue those kinds of honest questions. And he says, quote, "I would encourage you to employ this material in evangelistic dorm meetings and fraternity/sorority meetings, where you can compel people to really think about the desperate human predicament in which we all find ourselves." Yes, especially desperate if you frame it in the language that Craig uses here, which of course you don't have to, but shh, don't tell anybody that. And you know, reading this last quote here actually makes me kind of sad, in a way. Speaking of desperation, this poor guy, his desperation soaks these pages. His desperation to be important, to be influential, to be an inspiration, to be a leader of men, he says, "Go, students, take these lessons I have taught you and share them with your frat. Win your wayward brothers to Christ." It's pathetic. Not pathetic in a way that makes me empathize with Craig, because Craig is far too smug and condescending and stupid and too much of an asshole for that. In fact, after reading through this chapter again for you, I'm even over my empathy for him learning about death as a child that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. You know, honestly, after reading this chapter, fuck him. So not pathetic in that way, but pathetic more in a way that increases my already ample contempt for the man. Craig mentions in that quote and elsewhere in this chapter repeatedly the desperate human predicament. Well, there is no desperate human predicament. There is reality as it is and as it has always been. That we have trouble handling our shit in the face of oblivion, that we, and I include myself in this because I used to think this way, are a bunch of big crybabies who want more than we have, who aren't satisfied with just getting to live. We want to live forever. That we felt the need to invent myths and fantasies about gods and immortality, and then judged real life alongside those fantasies and found it wanting. All of that is not the universe's fault. That's our fault. There is a real world. We can examine it objectively. We can seek to discover it and understand it honestly. And we can accept whatever we find and build our purposes and our meanings and our values on top of that. Or we can turn away from it in favor of our infantile delusions, see Bill I can condescend to, about ultimate meaning and ultimate value and ultimate purpose and everlasting life. I've made my choice, and obviously William Lane Craig has made his. That's it for chapter 2. Next I'll do chapter 3, and that is the existence of God. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you for commenting. Atheists, Christians, everybody outside of those two categories, anybody who watches this and has something to say, please say it. Leave a comment, send me a message, make a video response, whatever. I thank those of you who watch these and find these of use and of interest. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you next time.